Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Dental Trade Alliance podcast. My name is Kevin Henry. Honored to not only be the host of this podcast, but also the editor in chief of drbycuspid.com. Thrilled today to be joined by Adam Block, PhD, who is the founder and principal of Charm Economics. Adam, how are you today?
Doing great. Thanks for having me, Kevin.
Hey, glad to have you on. I'm excited to talk about medical dental integration, kind of where we're going or where we could be going. But before we do that, I'd love for you to just take a moment and introduce yourself to our audience.
Sure. And so thrilled to be here today. So I have a pretty diverse background. I've been in most parts of the healthcare and dental industry over the course of my career. I started off working for Blue Cross Blue Shield Association, then got a PhD in health economics, where I spent 5 years. And then Obamacare was sort of starting to come on. I worked on Capitol Hill helping draft sections of the Affordable Care Act. And then once it passed, I went on and was a CMS regulator for 3 years. And in fact, I wrote the Essential Health Benefits regulation. That was my big regulation. After that, I worked for a health plans and hospital systems for about 5 years. And subsequent to that, took a teaching job where I'm a faculty member at New York Medical College and founded Charm Economics, where we build return on investment models and do lots of consulting for governments.
And I know you're very active with the Dental Trade Alliance. In fact, you just finished a webinar that was talking about MDI and what it could look like under a Biden Trump White House. So very excited to have you on to learn about that and kind of pick your brain a little bit here.
Sure. Yes, we've been working on MDI with the Dental Trade Alliance for the last 10 months or so. We have developed quite a few tools, including the webinar, but the webinar is really just sharing the information that we gathered in developing a manual. The manual talks about how quality improvement could change, how things like regulations are going to impact what happens to really to the provider groups as well as to the suppliers overall, and dealing with risk management, like all sorts of the technical stuff that executives need to deal with on a regular basis, but may not be the most fun stuff to deal with.
Well, I'm glad somebody like you is dealing with that. Absolutely. So before we look into the future and what MDI might look like, whoever wins the White House in November, let's take a step back and let's focus on what MDI is and kind of where we are right now with medical dental integration.
Sure. So what we have seen in the last 5 years is sort of breadcrumbs that there is a potential for MDI. We've seen discussions and potential interest in it. The clearest one is the appointment of Dr. Chalmers to be the first chief dental officer of CMS. But we've also seen that HR 3 passed the House of Representatives in 2019. It's not going anywhere, but it was a dental benefit. So often when you see things like this passing through, we've also seen the essential health benefits start to cover dental coverage and a bunch of dental codes being covered by Medicare, which is something that had never happened before. In the case where medically necessary dental care is required before medical care can be applied. So there's a bunch of these things that taken in independence could seem completely independent. But if you take them all together and they happen in the last 5 years, you're seeing a general direction that the administration is potentially going in an interest of trying to thread medical care and dental care together.
And let's make sure before we go any further that certainly anything that is shared on this podcast, it is not politically slanted, biased, whatever it might be. This is just information that Adam, you'll be throwing out there for whichever direction, again, the election goes in November. So I think that's an important little asterisk to have as we move forward, correct?
Yes, and so I also want to make clear that I am not, having a pro or a con position about medical dental integration, and neither is DTA. However, we have to recognize the realities that this is something that has been going directionally one way. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but a industry should be prepared for all contingencies. And this is certainly a likely enough probability that is a contingency. So it's not, I don't believe it's a 5% chance. I think it's much, much higher than that. And so it's something that the organization should be prepared for. And I have seen in the past when industries have not prepared for legislation that they didn't want to happen. Because they didn't want to happen, they didn't want to be seen as supporting it. You also need to be prepared for it happening. And so that's really what we're trying to share, not a pro or con approach, but like that this is something that could happen.
And again, the overarching reason that you're not only doing this webinar with Dental Trade Alliance, but also that you've been working with DTA in the past and you're doing this podcast today is the fact that MDI could very well have an impact on the dental industry and all of these companies that are members of DTA, as well as their customers, the dentists, and everybody else, correct?
Yes, I mean, so we've seen lots of cases of this in the past in the healthcare industry rolling into a broader market. And I'll just give two examples of similar cases from the past. The first is Obamacare passing. And when Obamacare passed, the real impact on the market from the provider perspective was that a whole bunch of people that were not insured suddenly became insured on January 1st, 2014. And so the industry, A, the suppliers, and B, the providers, had to be prepared for this influx of new folks that were coming into the market. In addition, they were coming in with what is called pent-up demand, which is that they had known for months and months that they were going to get insurance on this one day. And all of a sudden, they were going to, so if they had a minor need in August, they were not going to fulfill that need and pay themselves out of pocket in August. They were going to wait until they got insurance coverage on January 1st and get that need filled relatively soon after it started. And so the industry has to be prepared for this demand change to potentially happen if there is a passage of MDI.
So you mentioned those breadcrumbs that have been dropped along the way in recent years. So let's go ahead and continue that trajectory forward. And let's take the scenario that current President Biden wins the White House again in November. What might MDI look like in the next 4 years of that term, in your opinion?
So I like to divide it actually into something a little bit more granular than that, because you have the White House, but the White House has a very limited potential to change things unless it also has legislative support. And that means the Democrats would have to win both the White House as well as the Senate and the House. And the contingencies there are, particularly for the Senate, are not I haven't looked into the numbers specifically, but it's the probability is there is not that high. And so what you would see is an executive driven approach, which basically means that it would be regulatory only in change. And regulatory only in change means that you're not going to expand dental coverage to 20 million new people, because you would need a legislative change for that.
So, assuming from what you said right there, let's flip the coin. And then would a Trump White House win perhaps push things further along, knowing what may be happening in the legislative side of things as well?
So the Trump White House has never taken healthcare. So one of the advantages of this election is that both candidates have been president before for about 4 years. So you sort of know where they're going to go. And while there are often changes in second administrations, I think we're hearing that more from the Trump side. Um, the Trump administration has never taken a particularly active approach in overall healthcare or overall dental care. And so my expectation would be that many of the programs that were sort of bumping along would be continued, and that there wouldn't be a stopgap on that, because the only real firm line that the Trump administration took on healthcare was in opposition to Obamacare. It was actually very pro Medicare and Medicare expansion, and that's really where MDI would probably take root. But I don't expect it to change fundamentally in a Trump administration. In other words, I don't think there would be anything revolutionary that would be happening.
Is there anything under the MDI umbrella that perhaps the dental industry should be watching leading up to the election?
The dental industry and even healthcare industry are not things that candidates tend to talk about that much. So I don't think that it's going to come from like I don't think we're going to see any. There's nothing in the debates that's going to happen related to this. Um, what really I think is important to understand is who the candidates appoint to be the Secretary of Health and Human Services and what their priorities are, and then from a level down, the head of CMS. My expectation is that if Biden wins the election, he has been, in my opinion, happy with the two people that he has in there, Chiquita Brooks O'Shore, who's been running CMS, as well as Javier Becerra, who has been running HHS. And they have a long-standing, the two of them, meaning Chiquita Brooks O'Shore and Javier Becerra, have a long-standing relationship. They worked on the Hill together 15 years ago. So I would expect that would not change much. And often the administrations, sometimes they do change in a second, sometimes they don't. The Trump administration, I think, would bring in a whole new cast of characters that we may not have seen before for to run certainly to run HHS and maybe to run CMS.
So certainly I want to encourage DTA members to go to dentaltradealliance.org. Make sure that you find this webinar that Adam did on MDI and the ways that it could go. And last question for you, Adam, while I don't want to steal too much of your thunder from that webinar, I'm just wondering if there's one main point that maybe we haven't touched on yet that you want to make sure our listeners, I should say, know about MDI potentially moving forward.
Yes. So if MDI were to pass, you would see a demand change, but I don't expect the demand change to be overwhelming, meaning it's percentage points, which is probably good for the industry, but it's not 25 or 30% increase happening on one day. I just don't expect that to happen. But anytime the government and Medicare gets more involved in an industry, which it is not particularly involved in the dental industry right now, you see a greater amount of regulation and potentially impacts, right? So an example of that would be risk adjustment. Health plans are heavily dependent on risk adjustment payments, and providers actually spend a decent amount of their time dealing with risk adjustment and having to code for it. That might be something that spills over into the dental industry, even though it's not there right now. And that would be a change in the lives of the dental providers.
Well, Adam, I just want to say thank you on behalf of the members of DTA for all that you're doing to help keep them informed, and so glad that you're working with the Dental Trade Alliance. So thank you so much for your time today as well. I truly appreciate it.
Great. Thanks for the opportunity, Kevin, to share this information.
Absolutely. Want to make sure that you're checking out dentaltradealliance.org, not only for the webinar that Adam did on MDI, but also lots of other resources that are out there. And until next time, this is Kevin Henry, host of the Dental Trade Alliance podcast, signing off, wishing you nothing but success ahead.